My name is Mary Anna Cann Evans. I was born in the village of Marshallton at home. I lived there until I was married and grew up there, and it was a nice place to grow up. And
Who were your parents, Mary?
my parents came to Marshallton when my grandfather, who was a Methodist minister, was assigned to the Marshallton United Methodist Church as their pastor. So that's what brought the family to Marshallton. In my grandfather's family, they had 8 children, 7 boys and 1 girl. My father was the youngest and the only one to graduate from high school. He went on to...
His name was?
Pardon?
Your father's name?
My father's name was Merrill Brown Kirk Evans. Now, Merrill Brown Kirk Cann. My mother was Abbie Sellers Cann. They met in Kennett Square and were married in Glenworth by my grandfather, who was pastor there at the time. But when my grandfather came to Marshallton Church as a pastor, that brought the whole family to Marshallton, and a lot of them stayed because they liked it, and there were a lot of Canns living in Marshallton and the surrounding area. And my parents bought a house in Marshallton, a half of a double house, and then as the family grew, they bought the other half and put doorways so we could go from one side to the other.
This was the house you were born in? This was the house you were born in?
Yes, it is. And it's the second house going west from the firehouse, on the same side of the street as the firehouse. And then when they sold it, they sold each side separately and closed the doorways up. And we moved down the street to another house, and we lived there until I was 20 and got married. Marshallton was a very quiet, lazy place. I remember the Marshallton Inn, and we would see people, mostly men, but some women coming out there drunk and just sort of falling all over down the street. It was a place where my grandfather, Sellers, my mother's father, I guess he leased it or rented it, but he ran the bar at the Marshallton Inn for a while, and his family lived upstairs. And my mother remembers that very well. And so then...
And who were your siblings?
I have 2 siblings, 2 sisters, one older and one younger. And they live in the area with their families, and we never traveled far from Marshallton, except when my husband was in the service. We were in El Paso, Texas for 2 years. But then we always came back to Marshallton.
So Mary, when your early childhood in Marshallton and growing up in Marshallton, what are the earliest memories you remember of the people, the town itself? As a little girl, where did you go to school? Where did you go to church?
Okay, when I was, I guess 5 years old, I went to the demonstration school at the college for kindergarten, because at that time there was no kindergarten in the public schools. And then I came back and went to Marshallton Elementary School for 1st through 8th grades. And there were 2 grades in a room, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th and 8th. And Miss Anna Niels was the teacher for 7th and 8th grade. She was also the principal of the school. And the school was right in my backyard from where our house was.
That's the Goddard School, right?
Yes, it's at the Goddard School now. And it's a place where we played on the playground. We We played baseball. We rode our bicycles. It was just a place where the children in Marshallton played, even when they weren't going to school. In the summers, we rode our bicycles all over the village.
Was there any of your specific friends that you remember in general that you grew up with, that your best friends, so to speak, in town?
Well, I think they've all passed away.
Uh-huh.
My friends from those years. I'm 89, so a lot of them have already gone.
Mm-hmm.
But we went to church at the Methodist church, and we walked to church. We got dressed up for church. It was always a time where we put on our best dresses and walked up to church. It was a fun time because Santa Claus would always come at Christmas at the church and give everybody a little box of candy. It was a place where if anything happened in Marshallton, the whole town was involved. The firehouse used to have carnivals every year. I remember those, and they were fun.
And where were the carnivals?
They were right there at the firehouse. They set up tents and had all kinds. It was a regular carnival, and it was a lot of fun. They did that for several years.
Didn't they have Roy Rogers or so? They used to get some pretty big names, didn't they? So you looked forward to that every year, I'm sure, as a little girl.
Yes, everybody did.
As a young girl, did you hang out with your sisters a lot? Did you have a gang you hung out with?
Well,
Did you guys have any hangouts that as little girls you used to go to? I mean, you said the playground.
Yeah, we were friends with each other, but there's 4 years between each of us.
Okay.
So when you're little, that's a lot.
Yeah.
We're closer now that we're older.
And who is the oldest sister?
My older sister is Marge Barr.
Okay.
She's 94.
All right.
And my younger sister is Dora Hume, and she's 85. And she lives in Wellington, too, right down the hall from us.
Okay.
There's something else I wanted to say.
About the hangouts, about the fair. What were your holidays like? Where did you celebrate the holidays? You had a pretty large extended family. Did you have big get-togethers?
Yes, and we used to go to each other's house and see what we each got for presents. One year, I remember my presents were pretty limited. I thought, I didn't get as many presents as Marge and Dory. I wonder why. Have I been that bad? And so then after we opened them all, Daddy said, I wanted to take a ride, and we didn't know why, but we went down to the barn, one of the barns on Asco farms, and my main gift was a horse. That's why I didn't get a lot of boxes and things to open. I got a horse, which I had been praying for. I was close friends with Betty Baldwin, Buddy Meister, and she passed away quite a while ago, and she used to invite me down to ride. They had all kinds of horses and ponies, and I kept asking for a horse or pony, so I finally did get one and loved it.
And what kind of riding did you do? On the trails?
Mostly just cross country. Over little jumps, but mostly just, out for a Sunday ride, and kept him at the barn where Duke and I later lived, right up here on Cann Road and Shawsburg Road. That's where we kept him.
What was the countryside like when you used to ride?
It was very open, very open. Marshallton was here, Westchester was there, and there wasn't much between. It was pretty open, and all around Marshallton was open. Of course, with Asco Farms, it was 500 acres, so there was a lot of ground to ride on.
Okay.
And I felt very safe, and my sisters used to ride some too. I think I rode the most, but we had a lot of fun.
Where did you go shopping when you were a young girl? Was there any ice cream stores or places you
Well,
get ice cream?
We used to go shopping up at the corner of Strasburg and Sugarsbridge Road. There was a grocery store there. It was called Mike's. And Mike had hand-dipped ice cream. And we used to go up there and get ice cream. And we then we'd just walk around town eating our ice cream. And I had a dog, too, named Mickey.
Mm-hmm.
He used to follow me all over.
So did you ever go into Westchester and shopping trips?
We did go shopping in Westchester for clothes, things like that. At Christmas time, we would usually go into Philadelphia to Wanamaker's and Strawbridge's to see the decorations and to shop.
So growing up as a young girl in Marshallton, did the boys and the girls intermingle, or were they kind of separate? Did they each do their own thing?
Well, it was, they each would do their own thing most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Depends the age we were, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That would change. But in the summer, I rode my horse. Also, we all wanted to go swimming. And we used to walk down to the Brandywine. And my parents were not very happy with that because there were snakes and leeches and it was dirty. And so finally, my father and my uncle decided to build a pool on Asco Farms, which they did, and it's a large pool. It's where Marge and Doug Barr, my sister and brother-in-law, live. And it's a large pool. But they didn't just keep it for the family. They actually got a lifeguard who was a resident of Marshallton, right across from the 4 dogs. The Mike's was here, and Winnie Johnson lived there. And she was the lifeguard. They built a lifeguard stand for her, and all the children of Marshallton were welcome to go to the pool. And they used to all walk down and swim and walk back. And Winnie was the lifeguard. So that was a very nice experience in the summer.
And how many kids would be there at one time, possibly?
Oh, probably 20 to 30.
Really? So it's like almost a little country club.
It was.
Swim club.
It really was.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also went to camp in the summer. I went to the Girl Scout camp a couple of summers. I went to Camp Lookout up at Downingtown, a YMCA camp. And then when I was 12, 13, and 14, I went to camp in Virginia, and that was for 2 months. So I spent the summer there, and it was a wonderful experience. I had everything there.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents knew the owners of the camp, and that's how that came about.
Okay.
My sister Dory also went there. Marge did not. Also, in the summer, where we used to live up here on the corner, there was a tennis court my father put in. And
At the corner of where, Mary?
and my father was a good tennis player. And on the weekends, some of the men from Marshallton would come down and play tennis all day. And we would take picnics sometimes, and the kids would run around and play. And
Where was the tennis court again, Mary? Where was the tennis court?
the tennis court from the barn, if you go straight out, it was probably about where this middle house is now located.
This is up in Marshallton now, where you lived
Yes.
back in the alley. Okay.
Yes. We always intended to bring it back, but we never did. But my husband was a good tennis player too.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the summers were always very full
It
between
sounds like it.
going to camp or swimming or riding or.
How about 4th of July? Do you what'd you do on 4th of July? Did you see fireworks? Did you go someplace for fireworks?
You know, I remember the 4th of July, seems to me that was when Asco would have their picnic, and they would come out. They had it different places, but they would have it. They had it one year, not far from here, along Brandywine, just out in the field, and all the employees were invited, and it was a real nice day.
Mm-hmm.
Asco employed a lot of people, probably 250
We'll get into
at the
Asco
peak.
a little bit. Do you remember the Brandywine Picnic Park?
Oh, absolutely.
What memories do you have from that?
It was wonderful. I think my favorite were the boat swings.
The Lenape Park or the Brandywine Picnic Park?
Lenape Park was special to everybody that lived in this area. And we used to go down there. Our church always had their annual picnic down there. Different groups had their picnics there. But we would go down just, you know, several of us and have a good time. They had a
carousel.
They had a roller coaster. And as I said, my favorite was the boat swings. And the spook house, or whatever they call that.
So you went down as a group of people from Marshallton or from the church or whatever?
My husband and I used to go down. It was just a lot of fun. Everyone was very sorry when that ended.
So as you grew up and after high school, did you still stay in Marshallton? Where did you go after high school?
Well,
or should I say, I'm sorry, elementary school. You said you went to the Marshallton 1 through 8.
I went to Marshallton Elementary 1st through 8th grade. In 9th grade, I went into Westchester to the junior high. Then I went to Westtown School for 2 years, and I boarded there in 10th and 11th grade. And I wasn't real happy there, and I came back to Westchester for my 12th grade. That's when I met my husband. And after that, I went to Harcum Jr. College down at Bryn Mawr. And then that summer, we were married.
Okay.
And
who was your husband?
My husband is Duke Evans.
Okay. And where did you first live when you got married?
We lived in New York, Delaware when we first married, because he was a student at University of Delaware. And so he went to school, and I got a job at the school. And he had a couple other jobs on the side. And we lived in an apartment in New York, Delaware.
Okay.
And then he went into the service for 2 years because he was in the ROTC program. And we went to El Paso, Texas. By that time, we had 2 little boys. So we lived there for 2 years. Then we came back to New York, and he went back to Delaware and got his master's degree. Then we went to Maryland for a couple of years, and then we came back to this area. And we've stayed here ever since.
And you raised your family right around the Marshallton area. So Mary, growing up, we talked about your childhood and your later years. Describe the Marshallton community in general. From your perspective, you said it was a fun time growing up. You told us a lot of things you do. Are there any prominent people that you remember that were colorful characters back in the day?
Well, one of the most prominent people that I never knew, but I know his name, is Humphrey Marshall. And he built his own house in Marshallton and lived there. And it's still a very nice house, and it's still called the Humphrey Marshall House. And he's the most prominent that I think of. besides my father and my uncle, I guess.
Okay. So do you remember any old tales that people passed down of anything that might have taken place in Marshallton in the old days?
I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember any.
Where did people congregate back then? Obviously the Marshallton Inn.
Well, do you know where the Four Dogs is now?
Mm-hmm.
The Four Dogs was just it wasn't very fancy, but they had shuffleboard in there. And mostly the men of the town in the evenings would go up there and play shuffleboard. And that's before they fixed it up and became what it is today. So that's one place the men mostly held out.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't that many places to hang out in Marshallton, really. Marshallton was,
Like you said, a sleepy town.
it was.
Mm-hmm.
It was.
So Mary, you played an important role in the Blacksmith Shop in Marshallton. Just describe what you did there and your little shop and everything.
Well, after my father
And
passed,
describe the Blacksmith Shop, like what you first remember. You said it was a dirt floor. Kind of go into what it looked like before and then after and what you did.
the Blacksmith Shop was a place where the children in Marshallton would go on Saturdays because, of course, we were in school the other days. But on Saturday, we could hear the blacksmith. You could hear him hitting the anvil with his hammer. And he would be shoeing horses. And we would go down there, and the blacksmith would let us make rings out of nails. And he was very patient with us. But he, the blacksmith left there in 1958. He worked until then.
And his name was?
William Ludwig was the last one to work there. And he never owned the building, he always rented it. And my father purchased it from William McAllister, who lived next door in the brick house. And he and I had thought of having a shop there together when he retired, but unfortunately my father passed away. And then I acquired the shop, and my husband and I worked to restore it and make it usable.
So what was the shop like before you did any work to it?
The shop, when I acquired it, had dirt floors. There was no heat, no electric, no running water. It was in bad shape. The windows were, the water would come in and when it rained. So we just worked on the whole building and had heat put in the one side and had electric put in the whole building and running water. And we had, there was a hand-dug well out back, and we used that for water. But we spent a lot of time and money restoring it. And then I opened my shop in 1965, and I was there for 37 years. And I had an antique shop, and my only lighting was old lamps. So I took a liking to old lamps, and I learned how to make lampshades to go on them. And so I made a lot of lampshades. Customers would come in and say, well, I have an old lamp, I need a shade for it, can you do that? And so I would do that. I sold a lot of shades separately. I sold some on old lamps. Mm-hmm. By the time I retired, probably half of my business was making lampshades. I made, they're all paper. I did put fabric on some, like linen and such, but they were mostly the hand-cut and pierced paper lampshades. I painted some of them. Some of them were just cut. It was something that I really enjoyed, and I had a lot of nice customers, and I enjoyed the whole 37 years.
So your shop was on one side or both sides of the blacksmith?
When I started, the shop was on the two-story side, but it wasn't too long before I would open the door to the other side, because Mr. Ludwig had left some of his tools, although his son had taken a lot of them and had made a sort of little blacksmith shop in his basement. So then we replaced the anvil and the important things. There were a lot of old horseshoes hanging up on the rafters. And people were interested in seeing that side of the shop. The chimney was interesting.
So the brick hearth that's there and the brick chimney, that was all there before.
That's right.
And what about the bellows?
The bellows I had replaced, because by the time Mr. Ludwig left, there were no bellows. And so a friend found the bellows that are there now for me, and he put them in. And they look like they've been there forever.
Yeah.
The same with the back shed. It was deteriorating, and I had that whole back taken off and redone. So that's all redone. But it's new. It was new. It should last quite a while.
But was it essentially the same? You redid it in the same style and fashion that it
Yes.
was, because
Yes.
that shed was used to dry the wagons after they painted them upstairs.
That's right.
Do you want to talk
And
about
I
that?
hope the railing is still there,
The railing's still there.
because my son Kurt redid it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And he put the railing back up, and the wagons would go out and against the railing, and then they go down the side. Was a ramp that went down the side towards the inn, and that's where they would take them down off the roof.
Okay. And the upstairs is essentially the same, because there's the old paint on the walls from painting the wagons. You didn't touch that at all, did you?
No, we did paint the walls, but not the board wall between the two rooms.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I left because it was so interesting.
They had all the different colors.
Part of
on
the
it.
history
Yeah.
has all the different colors they would test before they paint the wagons. There's so much history. I have the list of all the blacksmiths that had worked there. I'd given it to someone. They should have it.
Yeah, we have that in the shop.
And
So while you restored it, did you find anything of interest there? What happened to the old well?
well, I used the old well until when I sold it. Then it was when they were putting the new grinder pumps through Marshallton.
Mm-hmm.
And so the well had to be filled in. That was after I sold it. So that was filled in. But I used that for water the whole time. And it was interesting. The heat in the two-story side is in the floor, radiant heat. I didn't want radiators or anything showing. So we did that, and then the water all came from that well. And every now and then, it would run dry. But if we just waited a couple weeks, it always came back.
Mm-hmm.
So we never did anything other than wait, and it came back.
Mm-hmm.
The bricks, well, when I started opening the door for the other side, people would go in, or I would go in, it was just soot from the blacksmith working on the floor. It was just soot. And it'd be all over your shoes, and I said, we have to do something there on the floor. So he worked very hard, and we put that brick down. And the brick came from Old Main at Westchester University. It was when they were tearing Old Main down, and we got the brick from there. We had to clean it, took hammers to knock the old mortar off, but we did it, and we put gravel in first and leveled it, and then put the brick down. Duke put all the brick down, maybe with our two oldest sons. And then we put sand on top of that and swept it in between the bricks. But we did it on the other side and all under the back shed. And
Now, a lot of the tools are still up there, laid out. They're obviously original from William Ludwig, correct? The old blacksmith tools and the horseshoes that are hanging up there?
I left all those. I left the anvil.
But that was basically there before you started, right?
Yes, yes. A lot of tools, and there were a lot of horseshoes.
Yeah. So Mary, after, when did you close up the blacksmith shop? About what year? What do you remember of any fires or anything in town?
Well, I had the blacksmith shop open for 37 years, and I closed when, in 2002, I retired and sold the building. At that time,
Now, there was a barn behind there.
there was a fire. There was a barn behind the house,
Whose
behind the
barn
blacksmith
was it?
shop.
Whose barn was it, and what was it used
Okay,
for?
the people, George McAllister, who owned the brick house next to the blacksmith shop, he owned that barn and the field behind it. I think the Marshallton Inn may own that field now, but when the barn burned, I'm pretty sure he still owned it, George McAllister. And it burned, and we lived on Lucky Hill Road at that time, and someone called us to tell us, so we went right up, and it was fully engulfed by that time, and complete loss, and I don't think they ever found out what caused the fire.
Do you think that barn could have been part of the blacksmith shop going way back?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think the house next door was like a little farmette. There was a garage and another little building, and then the barn that they owned, and all that field. And George McAllister and his wife had lived down on Lucky Hill, on Lucky Hill Road, where the Armstrongs now live. And my father purchased that farm from George McAllister. He went out with his checkbook one day and said, "What would you sell your farm for?" And he and his wife were getting older, and it was hard for them to do the work, and so he told my father, and he wrote him a check. And George McAllister said, "But now I need a place to live. I'd like to go up to Marshallton." So the red brick house was for sale, and that's what he bought.
Okay.
And he and his wife moved in there. But I don't think he really farmed that field. He just had someone cut the grass every now and then.
Are there any places that are not in Marshallton anymore that you remember that might have been torn down or had other fires? Anything that comes to mind?
The only other fire I remember is, it was later, was the Ashby barn on Northwark Road, and that's where the Volpones live now.
Okay.
And there was a very large barn on that property, and it burned. But that was later. But I don't remember other fires around Marshallton.
Do you remember the blizzard of '58? Were you around then?
I think we were living in Newark, Delaware then.
Okay. So Mary, I want to talk about the Cann family. We talked about prominent people in Marshallton, and obviously your father, Merrill, and Harry Cann started the Asco Cabinet Company. So why don't you talk about your family's legacy as it relates to the Asco Cabinet and your father, and how they got started, what was the idea, what they did.
Okay, my
Start out with your...
my Uncle Harry was trying to make a living. He had had a store in Marshallton, a grocery store, and that was in the green serpentine stone house, the long house. And he started selling refrigerators. And he went out to a farm one day and tried to sell a farmer a refrigerator for his wife. And he said, I don't want a refrigerator, but if you can find me something to cool my milk, come back. So he went back and he contacted my father and asked my father if he would come up. My father was working on the railroad in Wilmington at the time. And he asked my father if he would come up and join him and help try to make something to cool milk. And my father wrote him a letter and said, after thinking about it a long time, I will take 1 year's leave of absence from the railroad. Come up for 1 year and we'll see if we can do this. If not, I'll go back to the railroad. So he came up to Westchester and they started working on it. They rented space down, I forget what street it was. It was where you used to get your license in Westchester. And they rented a building and they started work there. And things were going pretty well, and then they needed more space, so then they rented space on Market Street, the corner of Market and Matlack. As you're going east, it would be on the right, on the corner property. And they rented space there. And they worked together and they came up with good ideas, and they invented the first electric milk cooler in the world. And that's what really started their business. And they
What year was that approximately, do you remember?
Well, I was born in 31, and it was about that time.
Late 20s.
Late 20s, early 30s. Of course, they needed more space if they were going to make these, so then the Sharpless Separator company had gone bankrupt, and so they put their buildings up for sale, and my father and my uncle bought the buildings, which is now the Sharpless Apartments in Westchester on East Biddle Street.
It's quite a big complex.
Yes, and it turned out to be a wonderful buy because they needed the space. They started making milk coolers. Then the government, we had the war come along, and they had government contracts, and they made cold rooms for on ships. And of course, the government needed a lot of cold rooms. They had a lot of ships. So they had, at one time, they had about 250 people working in the company, and they had 3 shifts. It was so busy. And then they started making other things, like they made a box for the railroad and sold a lot of those to the railroad, some kind of a box to shift the rails. And Then they made milk coolers, milking machines. They built a milking machine company and continued and made those. They eventually made freezers, all size freezers, mostly large freezers. They had
So your father never went back to the railroad?
he never went back to the railroad.
Nowhere near.
No, he
Did you
didn't.
ever go into work with him? I guess when his...
Oh, well, when we all the girls got to be teenagers, we went in and they taught us how to use the switchboard where you put the plugs in, you know, when the phone calls would come in.
So you worked there?
In the summer.
Mm-hmm.
We all did that, and we used to stop in all the time. But whenever I went in my father's office, which was where everybody was, it was just full of smoke. He was a heavy smoker, and he died at 67 of emphysema.
Now, where did he live at this time in his life? Was he still in Marshallton?
Yes, we were behind where Ernie Heimberger lives, and then we lived in the stone house behind Ernie Heimberger's, where now I think the owner of the Marshallton Inn lives.
Right.
A Avondale stone house, and Uncle Harry lived where Ernie Heimberger lives. So they were right there together.
Oh.
And
What did your father do in his spare time? Did he have any hobbies?
he loved to play tennis.
Okay.
He also loved to duck hunt and small birds. He would go down on the sassafras on the eastern shore, and he had a group of friends. They would go duck hunting. Excuse me. But he worked an awful lot. He would come home for dinner and usually go back to the office till after we were in bed. And he worked.
And he worked right until his passing away.
Well, the last few years he couldn't work, but he worked very hard.
What did your mother do during this period of time?
My mother was just a housewife, but she started the first Girl Scout troop in Marshallton. She also started the first library at our church, and she took care of three little girls.
Well, that was a chore, I'm sure, growing up.
My mother never drove a car, and so when we'd have any appointments or anything, my father would send somebody out from Asco to drive us.
What about the farms that Asco had or your father had? What were they used for?
Asco Farms was what we call an experimental farm. They experimented all the products they were making on the farm. Milk coolers, milking machines. They had
Cold rooms?
something that cooled the milk. It was sort of like this, wavy-like. And they had a herd of golden Guernsey cows. They owned the farm, where, as I say, where the Armstrongs are now, where they own the one where my sister lives now, Marchborough. They own all the ground all the way up to Marshallton.
Glenworth Farm, did they own that?
Pardon?
Did they own Glenworth Farm?
Oh,
where,
yes.
Where Joel Colvin lived?
We called that the dairy barn farm, and my boys used to call it the Dairy-O farm. Like, hi-ho the Dairy-O.
Okay.
And, but they loved to go down and see the cows and the bulls. There were bulls there.
How many head of cattle did you have? Do you remember?
Probably 20 to 30. And they sold the milk to, I believe, Highland Dairy. And but they also had someone deliver milk to all the relatives. Every morning, the milk can would be sitting on our back step. And when the church had suppers. They would deliver milk to the church to use for anyone who wanted a glass of milk.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was quite an operation that your father and your uncle had. At what point in time did they sell off the business? Whatever happened to Asco?
Well, as my father got sick, they realized they had to divide their assets. And so they started working on that and divided the assets. And then they wanted to find a buyer for the farm, and that came to be Mr. Laird. Have you heard of W.W. Laird?
Chick Laird, yeah.
So he lived in Wilmington, a very wealthy person who was just a relative of the DuPonts. And he came up and bought, I think, all of the land in East Bradford, because it was a mix of East and West Bradford.
Mm-hmm.
So he bought all the land in East Bradford.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think of Marshallton today as it's quite different, and yet it's the same. It's different. I think the houses are kept up better than they were years ago, but it really hasn't changed as much as you would think. The school is no longer an elementary school, it's the Goddard School, and the children that live in the village take a bus to another school now. I would miss that because I think I always wanted to ride a bus because I never rode a bus to school.
Mm-hmm.
I always ran out my back door to school, but it's like I say, things look better. The inn looks better. The Four Dogs looks better. But you know, you can't change it too much. But the surroundings of Marshallton have changed. It used to be completely open around the village, and now you leave Marshallton to go to Westchester, and there are houses sprouting up here and there. And so I don't know what people with young children would think about growing up there now, but it would be different than when I grew up there.
I always love to look at that old picture of Marshallton looking down the main drag of where you were born, that row of houses, and if you superimpose that old picture today, as you said, it really hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm. But that picture has the house in it that I was born in.
No. No.
That picture came from Nancy Hill. You remember Nancy?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
She found it in her father's house after he passed away.
Really?
And she gave me a copy, and we have one in our house right now.
So final reflections on the village and the community. You got to feel proud for what you've done here in your family's.
But I think I helped the Blacksmith Shop. We restored it, and I had a business there for 37 years. And the Marshallton Inn and Four Dogs has certainly improved and expanded and draws people all the time.
Yeah.
Except with the pandemic, but people still come to the Four Dogs and eat outside. And so I think it's different that way because it's more of a drawing card than it used to be.
Yeah. And I know Duke and your family too played a role in the deconstruction of Martin's Tavern, I guess you could call it. You were heavily involved back then. I was not involved, but certainly that was a part of
We were both
your family. And
we were both part of Martin's Tavern, and Duke was treasurer for several years.
right.
And
Yeah.
so,
Piece of the village, I
Now
guess.
talk about a building that isn't there anymore, but
Yeah, I
here
wanted
again,
Mary to talk a little bit about that, because she
I,
knows some things that would be interesting to have on her film.
I remember when I was growing up, a family actually lived in the first floor of Martin's Tavern. And I actually went to a birthday party of a friend that was living there. And it wasn't in real good shape, but it was still there. Well, thank you for having me, and I think it's wonderful you're doing this.
well, thank you.